K2 is an enormous, imposing summit located deep within the Karakoram Range in Pakistan. Standing at a height of 8,611 meters at its summit, K2 is the second highest mountain in the world, surpassed by only Mount Everest, and is one of only 14 mountains in the entire world reaching a height of over 8,000 meters. Amongst these 8,000ers, K2 is renowned as one of the most difficult and deadly of the bunch, and its fearsome reputation has even transcended the confines of just the mountaineering community as well, as K2 is right up there with Annapurna in my video comments section poll on my previous video shown on screen as the most frequent blind answer to my question of what's the deadliest mountain in the world. However, as I covered in that video's sequel video, also shown on screen, in actuality, K2 is far from the deadliest mountain in the world, although it has traded the title of the deadliest of the 8,000ers with Annapurna throughout the years, a title which is now held by Nanga Parbat. Now, I won't delve too much into the specifics of why K2 has garnered a reputation so deadly that it is transcended beyond the sport of mountaineering. However, to greatly oversimplify it, K2 has, as I mentioned, at points held the title of the deadliest of the 8,000ers, and quite understandably to people unfamiliar with what contributes to a peak's overall deadliness, most would assume that since the 8,000ers are the highest mountains in the world, they must be the most difficult as well. A fallacy that regular viewers of my mountaineering content are undoubtedly aware of at this point. Now, if we follow this same line of logic, it's readily apparent why, despite its deadly reputation, K2 is one of the 8,000ers with the highest number of annual summit attempts, particularly within the last decade or so, as successfully ascending K2 both serves as a milestone of sorts for many serious hardcore high-altitude mountaineers, as well as serving as a satisfactory end goal for experienced yet less ambitious or more risk-averse mountaineers to strive for, as successfully completing an ascent of K2 is a feat that touts a certain level of prestige both within the mountaineering community and outside of it, and additionally, honestly, to most people, just saying you ascended the second highest mountain on the planet is much more impressive than trying to explain why it's more impressive that you managed to ascend, say, the world's 41st highest summit. If you know, you know, but needless to say, the latter achievement is both considerably more difficult and an almost infinitely more impressive feat to accomplish. But there's also a pretty decent chance that your hypothetical friend Betty in Oklahoma probably wouldn't know that offhand, but there's a decent chance she's probably at least heard of K2. However, while K2's overall widespread infamy and deadliness are quite frankly, statistically speaking at least, rather overstated, that is not to say that K2's reputation materialized out of thin air either, and to briefly touch on one of the prevailing themes of my world's deadliest mountain iceberg video, regardless of a summit's difficulty, its popularity is, generally speaking, to a large extent the greatest indicator of the total number of fatalities suffered on a summit's slopes. And as of the most recently reported numbers available as of the time of making this video, the total number of casualties reported at the end of 2024 numbered just under 100 people who have lost their lives on K2's slopes throughout its storied history. Now, while most people even just adjacently familiar with mountaineering could likely tell you about the deadliest season in K2's history, 2008, as it's right up there with Everest 96 as far as its widespread mainstream coverage. So obviously I'm not going to be delving into detail about that incident in this video. However, the incident I'll be covering in this video certainly gives the 2008 disaster a run for its money as far as deadliness goes, and it's one of the most frequently requested topics I get from you guys in my comment sections. So if you have an idea you'd like to see me cover at some point, make sure to leave it in the comments. I love reading through the comments, and when people suggest good ideas, I throw it on my list, and then eventually I get around to it. So make sure you do that, and subscribe too. Anyways, this hotly requested and particularly deadly climbing season on K2 was none other than the summer climbing season of 1986. The extraordinarily deadly K2 summer climbing season of 1986 would claim its first 2 victims on June 21st. The doomed duo consisted of 2 climbers named John Smolich and Alan Pennington, who were members of an American expedition team attempting to ascend one of the last major unclimbed routes on K2 up the Southwest Pillar, a route known as the Magic Line, which naturally was a highly coveted first ascent to attempt to accomplish. While the 2 men were in the process of following their planned route up the peak, they would suddenly find themselves in the path of a massive, sweeping avalanche cascading down K2's sheer slopes directly towards them. Unfortunately, despite their best efforts, the 2 were swept up and subsequently buried within the enormous, rushing wave of debris. The surviving members of the expedition team would manage to locate Alan's remains within the avalanche's expansive settled debris field, but they were ultimately unable to locate John's body before officially calling off their bid for the summit and retreating from the mountainside in defeat. The following deaths on K2 during the 1986 summer climbing season would take place just 2 days later, as while the American expedition team had been making their attempt at completing the first successful ascent of the highly coveted Magic Line, simultaneously a small 4-member French expedition team consisting of a man named Michael Parmentier, a woman named Wanda Rutkowicz, and a married couple named Maurice and Liliane Berard, who had notably dubbed themselves as, quote, the world's highest couple. Much like the aforementioned American team, the 4 French climbers were attempting their own historic first ascent of sorts on K2 as well. However, they were following the standard route up the Abruzzi Spur. Notably, all 4 of the team's members were attempting this ascent without the use of supplemental oxygen, which, for those of you who are unaware, is a major boon to high-altitude climbers who do choose to utilize it, as the low concentration of oxygen in the air at elevations above 7,000 meters greatly increases the physical efforts expended whilst climbing. Furthermore, the lower levels of oxygen can also lead to clouded judgment and irrational or otherwise poor decision-making as well. These symptoms are only exacerbated at elevations exceeding 8,000 meters, which is aptly named the death zone, where the oxygen concentration within the air is so low that the human body is unable to sustain itself even while fully at rest. Additionally, the aforementioned cognitive impairments tend to be particularly potent at elevations above 8,000 meters, especially for exhausted climbers whose bodies are particularly starved for oxygen. Now, with all of this in mind, it's easy to see the boon provided to mountaineers who do opt to use supplemental oxygen, and thus ascents made without the use of supplemental oxygen are seen as more purist in a sense. And additionally, ascents without the use of supplemental oxygen hold a certain merit, particularly amongst fellow mountaineers, that distinguishes them from ascents made using supplemental oxygen. Now, honestly, this whole supplemental oxygen versus no supplemental oxygen concept is really only a big deal on ascents of 8,000ers, and while I could continue on in great detail as to why this is the case, I'll spare you such an explanation for now, as this video's already going to be a long one. But it is relevant to this story to note that as of the start of the summer climbing season of 1986, a successful ascent of K2 without the use of supplemental oxygen had yet to be made by a woman, a title which both Wanda and Liliane sought to claim for themselves during this fateful bid for K2's summit in 1986. On the morning of June 23rd, after departing from their high camp located at an elevation of 7,894 meters, Wanda, who was the strongest climber of the team and who was also fueled by her burning ambition to be the first woman to reach the summit of K2 without the use of supplemental oxygen, would break away ahead of the other climbers in the team who lagged behind her. Later that afternoon, her ambitions indeed would lead her to accomplish this goal, as she would reach K2's summit in triumph approximately 30 minutes before the other 3 members of the team, and she would take this time to revel in her accomplishment and take in the breathtaking view from the summit while she waited for her teammates to join her there, rather than opting to begin descending ahead of the other 3 members of the group. Michael, Maurice, and Liliane would rendezvous with Wanda, as previously mentioned, approximately half an hour following her arrival at the summit, and after the trio spent a few more minutes at the summit, they would begin their descent back to high camp at 7,894 meters together that afternoon. However, as the remaining hours of sunlight began to wane, the party would soon realize that their descent was not progressing at the pace they'd planned, and by the time the sun had begun to fade behind the western horizon, they had only managed to descend a little over 300 meters from the summit, as all 4 climbers were thoroughly exhausted from the extensive amount of energy they'd expended to reach the summit, which then bogged them down and slowed the pace of their descent to a crawl. With sunset rapidly approaching and maintaining their current pace, high camp was about 2 to 3 hours distance further down the mountainside, and so the 4 French mountaineers would be faced with a difficult dilemma that would require an equally difficult and potentially life-altering or ending decision: continue their descent in the pitch darkness and sheer cold of the night, and escape the death zone above 8,000 meters, or attempt to hunker down at their current elevation of 8,300 meters, which meant risking withstanding the worst of the night's elements on the most exposed and severe stretch of K2's slopes, as well as the additional hours they'd have to endure spent in the ever-constant, further physically and mentally impairing death zone. Notably, however, the French summit team was not the only successful summit team struggling with the pace of their descent, as a duo of similarly spent Spanish climbers named Maria Brego and Josema Casimiro, who had reached K2's summit shortly after the 4 French climbers had begun their descent, and similarly had made the ascent without the use of supplemental oxygen, would catch up to the 4 French mountaineers as they deliberated their decision. Ultimately, collectively, the 2 teams would agree that the latter option was likely the most prudent course of action to take given their provided circumstances, and the 6 climbers would set to work setting up tents at what appeared to be the best site to bivvy for the night, anchoring them down and settling in for what would surely prove to be a long and frigid night. The following morning, on June 24th, after a hellish night spent at their bivvy at 8,300 meters, all 6 climbers would indeed emerge from their half-buried tents with their lives still intact, although after spending the night well within the confines of the death zone, they now found themselves feeling even more physically and mentally drained than ever, and thus all 6 would urgently disassemble their equipment and once again began to trudge their way back down K2 slopes to the relative safety of high camp, just several hundred meters below. As all 6 were keen to descend with utmost haste, and at this point their extended stay within the death zone likely had altered their decision-making skills as well, as instead of making the descent together, the 6 climbers rather would descend in slightly staggered pairs, with the duo of Spanish climbers being the first to depart the bivvy site and were the furthest ahead, followed by Michael and Wanda, with Liliane and Maurice lagging the furthest behind, although While the two duos of French teammates did maintain quite some distance between themselves, Wanda and Michael would frequently check behind them for Liliane and Maurice, who, while progressing slowly, were still clearly visible to the leading pair. However, Wanda would later recount that, while doing just that, the whipping winds high on the mountain created powerful snowdrifts, which obfuscated her view of Maurice and Liliane completely. When she glanced back to check on them just a short while later, the couple had seemingly completely vanished from the mountainside, and Wanda's previous sighting of them would be the last time that either would ever be seen alive again. Notably, the weather conditions as the climbers descended that morning had only continued to worsen, particularly the vicious high winds, which had subsequently resulted in an abundance of swirling snowdrifts that continued to hamper visibility, and thus Michael and Wanda would reason that they had just lost sight of Maurice and Liliane due to the increasingly foul weather and would continue their labored descent back to high camp. Upon reaching the relative safety of high camp, however, with the weather conditions only worsening, Wanda, who was suffering from frostbite on her nose and toes, would opt to descend further to seek medical treatment for her frostbite, while Michael decided he'd wait up at high camp to rendezvous with Liliane and Maurice and would eagerly await the pair's arrival there. Michael would wait the entire day for the duo to arrive, and with the weather conditions continuing to rapidly deteriorate after nightfall, Michael would relentingly begin his own descent in defeat, a harrowing experience in which he narrowly avoided becoming the next fatality on K2 that season. Liliane's lifeless remains would be located a few weeks later at the bottom of a steep cliff face, which strongly suggested that the couple had mistakenly veered off their intended course, likely due to reduced visibility from the whipping snowdrifts, and had accidentally fallen to their deaths from the cliffside. Notably, Maurice's body wouldn't be discovered until 1998, where it was located in a section of the glacier just above base camp, likely a result of his remains slowly being swept down the mountainside by the perpetual motion of its elements. Maurice and Liliane Berard's deaths would mark the final fatalities on K2 slopes in the month of June of 1986. However, the month of June had only just set the deadly precedent for the following summer months yet to come. In early July, a duo of highly skilled Polish mountaineers named Jerzy Kukuczka and Tadeusz Piotrowski would attempt to ascend K2 via the difficult and treacherous central rib of the peak's southern face. After braving the exposed conditions along the route, the duo's efforts would be rewarded with triumph as they would reach the summit on July 8th, marking the first ascent of what would become known as the Polish Route. The duo would then begin their descent back towards the base of the mountain following the standard route down the Abruzzi Spur. However, not long after beginning their descent, the weather would begin to rapidly deteriorate, which would cause the duo to scramble down the mountainside to erect a bivy site just beneath the precipice of the death zone, where they were forced to hunker down in their bivvies for 2 days. And expecting a swift descent after summiting, the duo's food supplies had long since been exhausted by the time the weather had cleared enough for them to continue their descent on July 10th. However, not long after the duo began their descent, as they reached an elevation of approximately 7,900 meters, one of the worst fears of any mountaineer became reality for Tadeusz. While the duo were descending, unroped, he realized he had botched attaching his crampons to his boots after they came loose and tumbled down the mountainside, leaving him in very dire straits as he now faced descending one of the steepest stretches of K2 without crampons and unroped. Unfortunately, the loss of his crampons would indeed prove to be fatal for Tadeusz, as he would tumble to his death down K2's steep slopes not long after suffering the loss of his crampons. The following fatality on K2 would take place under a week following Tadeusz's tragic death, and much like the preceding fatality, the next casualty of the deadly summer of 1986 was similarly the victim of unfortunate happenstance. On July 16th, a highly experienced and skilled Italian solo climber named Renato Casarato had been attempting the first descent of the aforementioned Magic Line route up the peak's southwest pillar. However, after he noticed the weather conditions on K2 slopes had rapidly begun to deteriorate, Renato would decide to abandon his ascent attempt and return to base camp to wait out the foul weather system, and radioed his team, which included his wife back at base camp, to inform them of his descent before setting off. While Renato was weaving his way across the crevasse-riddled glacier located just above base camp, one of the ladders serving as a bridge would suddenly collapse as he crossed it, resulting in Renato plummeting 40 meters into the eerie depths of the crevasse below, taking a hard fall but landing with his life still intact. He would quickly retrieve his radio from his backpack and radioed his wife back at base camp, who informed the rest of the team stationed there of his dilemma, and they quickly leapt into action to hoist him out of the glacier. After they located Renato, they would manage to hoist him to the surface and helped him to his feet to further assist his descent back to base camp. However, after taking a few steps, Renato collapsed on the ground and died, the result of severe internal hemorrhaging suffered during his initial fall. Renato's remains were subsequently redeposited into the crevasse at his wife's insistence, indeed a fitting final resting place for the avid mountaineer, and Renato's death would mark the final fatality of the month of July. However, the upcoming month of August would prove to be even more lethal yet, deadlier than the previous 2 months combined. In early August of 1986, a small 4-man Slovak-Polish expedition team consisting of team leader Janusz Meyer, as well as climbers Przemysław Piasecki, Peter Bozic, and Wojciech Wroś, were the next team to attempt to make the first successful ascent of the Magic Line up K2's southwest pillar. Despite the climbers foregoing the use of supplemental oxygen, they would ultimately triumph where the others had failed, and would reach the summit late in the afternoon on August 3rd. However, this meant that the team was forced to make their way down from the summit in near complete darkness, or brave spending the night in the death zone. Much like the story earlier in the video with similar circumstances, they would ultimately end up sharing in this decision with another separate summit team who would reach the summit shortly after they had departed it, in this instance, a South Korean expedition team. However, unlike the story earlier in the video, these two teams would decide that descending in the dark was the more prudent course of action, and so they joined forces for their descent in near pitch darkness, which slowed their descent to a crawl. As the exhausted mountaineers were at an approximate elevation of 8,250 meters, rappelling down past the infamous giant overhanging sérac on a section of K2 known as the Bottleneck later that evening, tragedy would suddenly strike when Wojciech, who was at the rear of the group, would suddenly vanish, to the surprise of his 3 teammates as well as the South Koreans, who were just slightly ahead of him. After he had just suddenly vanished without a trace, they presumed that he had somehow become unclipped or had rappelled off the end of the fixed rope line that they were rappelling down, and had rather eerily, seemingly plummeted to his death below, quietly enough that he hadn't caught the attention of his teammates while doing so. It wouldn't take long for his death to be followed up by the next fatality on K2, however, which would take place the following day. Notably, the following fatality on K2 was in fact a member of the aforementioned South Korean expedition team. However, this death was in fact far removed from the deadly happenings the prior evening near the summit. On the afternoon of August 4th, a Pakistani high-altitude porter employed by the South Korean expedition team named Muhammad Ali was in the process of hauling equipment between base camp and the higher camps when he was suddenly struck and killed by fast-falling rocks plummeting from above while he was traversing along K2's lower slopes. Unfortunately, following Muhammad's sudden death on August 4th, there would only be less than 48 hours of reprieve before K2 would claim yet its next victim. Now, if you hadn't surmised by the outcomes of the incidents I've covered in this video, and by the length of it thus far, the summer of 1986 on K2 is what one might call a bit of a tough season, as quite clearly the conditions on K2's slopes that summer were particularly hostile to mountaineers, as evidenced by the long streaks of foul weather, as well as near-constant bone-chilling winds lashing against K2 nearly non-stop all summer long, leading not only to the deaths that we've covered in the video so far, but also the ultimate failure of a number of other expedition teams that we haven't touched on in the video to reach the summit successfully. Now, amongst these failed expedition teams, the decision to call off their teams' bids for the summit was not a decision that many members of these teams would seemingly accept, and thus a few stragglers from several expedition teams still holding on to their summit dreams would band together to form their own team for one final attempt at reaching the summit. This new hastily cobbled together summit team consisted of a British climber named Alan Rouse, another British climber from a different expedition team named Julie Tullis, as well as her teammate from her former expedition team, an Austrian man named Kurt Dienberger, as well as 3 Austrian climbers from yet a different expedition team named Hannes Weiser, Alfred Imitzer, and Willy Bauer, as well as a Polish climber named Dobrosława Miodowicz-Wolf, who would make their bid for the summit following the standard route up the Abruzzi Spur. This ragtag team of summit hopefuls would reach high camp at roughly the same time as the aforementioned South Korean summit team from earlier in the video on the evening of August 2nd. The South Koreans would wake in the early hours of the following morning to clear skies that were forecasted to last throughout the entire day, prime conditions for a summit push. However, while the South Korean team eagerly began their preparations to depart for the summit, they would find that the remnant expedition team clearly did not share in their enthusiasm regarding the perfect weather conditions, as they would inform the South Koreans that they would instead opt to take a day to rest at high camp before making their own push for the summit. However, by the time they emerged from their tents on the morning of August 4th, the small window of favorable weather had seemingly closed for the remnant team's members, which, well, quickly plunged the group into chaos as its members bickered amongst each other over what the best course of action to take would be. Of course, the fact that the members of this team hailed from several previous failed expedition teams and thus held little loyalty to each other only further complicated matters. After they bickered for a while about what to do, eventually Rouse and Wolf, who despite the weather were still very adamant about making a push for the summit that morning, would decide to depart from high camp for the summit before anyone else had reached a decisive decision regarding the matter, and set off towards the summit in poor weather conditions, which showed no sign of easing, and were in fact only worsening as the minutes passed. The next climbers to splinter off from the larger collective to make their own push for the summit were two of the aforementioned Austrian climbers, Alfred Imitzer and Willy Bauer, who set off a short time after Rouse and Wolf had departed from high camp. Finally, the last duo, consisting of Julie Tullis and her Austrian teammate from her previous expedition team, Kurt Diemberger, would depart from high camp a short while following Bauer and Imitzer's departure for the summit, thus setting the stage for the tragedies still yet to unfold. As Rouse and Wolf trudged their way through the whipping winds and billowing snow towards the summit, Wolf's pace began to lag considerably behind Rouse's, and thus the two would eventually become separated, as Rouse opted to forge his path to the summit alone and continued his ascent ahead of Wolf as she began to lag further and further behind him. However, while Rouse's pace may have been fast enough to leave Wolf lagging far behind him, he too had been making relatively slow progress towards the summit, so much so that approximately 100 meters below the summit, the two Austrians who had departed after him and Wolf, Bauer and Imitzer, would catch up to him, and thus the three men agreed to make the final 100-meter push to the summit together, which they would reach successfully later that afternoon at around 4 p.m. The trio wouldn't revel in their accomplishment on the summit for long though, as the precious few remaining daylight hours, which were already mostly blotted out and muted by the stormy weather, were fading fast, and the blizzard engulfing K2 was only worsening. Not too long after the three exhausted men began their descent back towards the relative safety of high camp from the summit, approximately 150 meters beneath the summit, they would happen across Wolf, who was completely exhausted and had fallen asleep in the snow. After they managed to rouse her from her impromptu slumber, they managed to convince her to abandon her bid for the summit, despite having made it just within reach of it, and given the circumstances and condition they'd found her in, she didn't protest all too much before readily agreeing to abandon her summit bid and accompany the trio for their descent back to high camp. A little further down the mountainside, the four descending climbers would cross paths with the final duo to leave high camp, Julie Tullis and Kurt Diemberger, who were still making their way towards the summit. The trio that had successfully reached the summit would similarly attempt to persuade Tullis and Diemberger to abandon their bid for the summit. But after they had mulled over this proposal for a while, seemingly overcome by summit fever, they would ultimately opt to continue their push for the summit despite the late hour, with Diemberger later recounting their reasoning for doing so, stating, quote, "I was convinced it was better to try it finally after all these years," and Julie too said, "Yes, I think we should go on. There was a risk, but climbing is about justifiable risks," he stated. Tullis and Diemberger would indeed continue their push for the summit and would reach it successfully around 7 p.m. that evening, just as night fell on the mountainside. Meanwhile, the four descending climbers would successfully return to high camp not long after Diemberger and Tullis finally reached the summit. Almost immediately after Tullis and Diemberger had departed from the summit, Tullis, who was above Diemberger, slipped and fell, causing her to begin to slide. Diemberger would later recall the incident, stating, quote, "I thought I could hold us, but then we both started sliding down the steep slope, which led to a huge ice cliff. I thought, my God, this is it. This is the end," he recalled. However, fortunately, the duo were ultimately able to arrest their slide before plummeting to a similar grim fate as the Berards, but the incident would leave the pair shaken at the prospect of a further fall while descending in darkness, as they had actually been the party to discover Liliane's body just days earlier, and thus they were acutely aware of the possibility of sharing in their fate. Thus, the duo would decide to bivvy high on K2 slopes at an approximate elevation of 8,300 meters. Dienberger and Tullis would endure a frigid night in their bivvies. However, crucially, they would both emerge from their bivvies the following morning on August 5th, chilled to the bone but alive. However, as the duo of exhausted climbers trudged their way back down towards high camp, the winds soon began to lash against them with increasing intensity, and the falling snow around them grew more and more dense. And as the afternoon rolled around, the pair knew that they urgently needed to reach high camp by nightfall. The duo would in fact successfully make their way back to high camp after their arduous endeavor to rejoin Wolf, Rouse, Imitzer, Bauer, and the other Austrian, Hannes Weiser, who hadn't made a push for the summit, but had waited for the other remnant team members to return to high camp. However, by the time Tullis and Dienberger had made it back to high camp, the incoming blizzard had now fully engulfed K2's upper slopes, and the climbers there would soon realize how bleak their situation really was, even within the perceived safety of camp. In fact, the mountaineers were running extremely low on fuel for their camp stoves, meaning that when it did inevitably run out soon, they'd be left unable to cook food, or more importantly, melt snow for use as drinking water. However, with the storm raging outside their tents, the 7 mountaineers stranded up at high camp had little choice but to wait for the weather conditions outside to improve so they could finally attempt their descent. However, they would awake the following morning on August 6th to find themselves still trapped in whiteout blizzard conditions, and thus would wait out the storm for another day at high camp. Additionally, that evening, either in the final few hours of August 6th or the early morning hours of August 7th, the toll of the fall, the high altitude, and overall exhaustion would prove to be too much for Julie Tullis's body to endure any longer, as she would die quietly in her tent overnight on the evening of the 6th or the early morning of the 7th. Additionally, this was around the time that the climbers also reached the long-dreaded moment when their supply of stove fuel ran completely empty. The storm would rage throughout the rest of the 7th, as well as throughout the entirety of the 8th and 9th as well, and by the early morning hours of August 10th, all 6 of the climbers remained alive, yet in a trance-like state, severely dehydrated and starving, and on the cusp of death. By dawnbreak on August 10th, the weather conditions had finally cleared enough for the mountaineers to attempt their descent from high camp, as the snowfall had ceased almost entirely, but the powerful winds continued to lash against K2's unforgiving slopes. These relative weather improvements, combined with the desperate condition of the climbers stranded at high camp, would spur them to attempt their last-ditch effort to descend to the lower camps further down the mountainside. Wolf would attempt to stir Rouse from his trance-like resting state that morning, only to find that he was heavily hallucinating and in a state of near death, and in no condition to attempt the descent with the rest of the party, and so the delusionally weary party of 5 would depart without him from high camp on the morning of August 10th. However, their ranks would quickly thin to just 3 members a short time after their departure, as Imitzer and Weiser were so weak that they would collapse and die not far from high camp. However, when the 3 climbers reached the next camp below, Camp 3, they would discover in horror that the camp had been abandoned and destroyed in the storm. Upon making this discovery, the distraught mountaineers would decide to part ways from there and instead make their own descents down to the next camp, Camp 2, individually. Bauer would be the first to arrive at Camp 2 later that evening at around 9 p.m., followed by Dienberger about an hour later at 10 p.m., where they finally had access to a stove to melt snow water to drink. Wolf, however, wouldn't arrive later that evening at all, or the next morning either, as the two Austrians would await her arrival until noon on the 11th before departing towards advanced base camp below, opting to descend together again once more. Both of the men would successfully reach base camp and were then evacuated by helicopter out of the region a few days later on August 16th, with both having suffered severe frostbite as a result of their harrowing ordeal on K2 slopes. A small search party for Wolf was then dispatched and ascended as far as 7,100 meters without finding any trace of her before they ultimately called off the search. Thus, she would mark the final fatality of the particularly lethal 1986 K2 summer climbing season. The tragic events of this summer truly serve as a reminder of the importance of heeding a well-known saying amongst mountaineers, which is, remember, you're only halfway through the climb when you reach the summit. It's all too easy to forget you still need to get down. Thank you all for watching.